Hi, I'm continuing to speak here about a topic that I started this week related to the role of historical narratives in extremist propaganda. As I mentioned earlier at the end of the first video, I will get now to speaking about the role of prophecy within the theory of Back to the Future. While the previous other topics that has been mentioned in this big subject have outlined how historical narratives can be exploited to strengthen different aspects of a system of meaning, sometimes history alone is not enough. Historical narratives indeed are used as evidence to support a group's arguments and narratives, or to connect the current circumstances to some greater intergenerational struggle, connecting the present to the past. Another technique used by the propagandist is the exploitation of historical prophecies to connect the present to the future. Together, these make a very strong tool, and the group is portrayed as rooted in history, looking to the future, and tied to the divine. The Christian Identity Movement example exploits biblical prophecies extensively to justify its narrative. First, it is reinterpreting history through the lens of biblical prophecies, using a suitably realized prophecies to assert its legitimacy. For example, early British Israelist G. H. Allen first traced the lineage of the Anglo-Saxons back to the biblical figure of Ephraim, and then interpreted the prophecy that Ephraim would father many nations, as it has been mentioned on Genesis 48:19. And that was a reference to the British Empire subsequently in history. Similarly, he goes on to link the prophecy of another biblical figure, Manasseh, whose descendants would go on to form a great nation, to the United States. Connecting the in group to supposed realized prophecies creates a false sense of truth and legitimacy in their narratives. And if we go outside of the Bible just for 1 minute, and if we speak about this concept of prophecies, and we bring the example of Nostradamus, an example in history, and if we do analyze all the things that has been written by Nostradamus at his time, and many people are subjectively impressed by the fact that those are events that would be occurring later, several centuries later. I would take three examples. If you take the example where he mentioned the year 999, which is the only number that appears, the only year that appears in the prophecies of Nostradamus. This could refer to events that were occurring during the year 999, before the year 1000. When he speaks about the events of the assassination of a black monk in Varennes, it is usually said that people believe that it's the Varennes, where basically a black monk has been assassinated by revolutionaries at the time of the French Revolution, which means several centuries later. But if you want to go deeper in the analysis, there are several other burgs and small towns in other areas in France that were called Varennes at the time, and that could be related to an event that has occurred during the time of living of Nostradamus. Finally, the most common example mentioned about these prophecies, one has to believe that Nostradamus was right about describing the occurrence of the Second World War and the name of Hitler, misspelled as Hister. The Hister is a reference to the Danube river, and therefore there are several events and several issues that have been happening centuries before, ever since the golden age of the Roman Empire, during those times, around the Hister River, during battles of conquests, etc. And this would refer more to an event that has happened centuries before even Nostradamus was born. So those prophecies were not something projected in the future. If you analyze them, most of them are about many events that occurred in the past or during the time where he lived. To get back to the topic, as it evolved, the Christian identity movement that became more extreme and increasingly focused on the unfulfilled prophecies of the Book of Revelation and on millenarian sentiments fueled by the recent world wars and the Cold War. The new focus connecting unfulfilled apocalyptic prophecies to the present and near future created a sense of urgency in the analysis of the Christian identity. It has been described through a combination of historical narratives and future prophecies as producing a sort of Doppler effect, as adherents rush from an increasingly expansive history toward an increasingly compressed timeline for near future upheaval of the world order, imbuing the outgroup threat with an apocalyptic sense of urgency. When Al Qaeda Central launched its most recent affiliate, Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, in September 2014, the narrative they used referred to the Hadith prophecy about Ghazwat al Hind, Battle of India, which foretells the Muslim conquest of India and promises those who take part the reward of a place in paradise. The group's first major attack at the naval shipyard in Karachi in September 2014 was heralded as a clear message to India that Ghazwat al-Hind has only just begun. However, the exploitation of this particular narrative is nothing new and has been a mainstay of jihadist groups in the subcontinent since 1988, when they emerged in Indian-controlled Kashmir. The prophecy is used to cast the group's action as part of a larger, inevitable conflict, and seemingly demonstrate their legitimacy because they are fulfilling a prophecy. The Ghazwat al-Hind prophecy is not the only Hadith prophecy to be exploited by militant Islamists in South Asia. Hussein Haqqani describes the other passage that has been used in the 1980s jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan that I cite here. During the war against the Soviets and the ensuing Taliban rule, ancient prophecies of Khorasan, which includes modern Afghanistan, resurface to inspire jihadists and promise great heavenly rewards. These prophecies foreshadow the appearance of the Mahdi or Messiah and the final battle between good, which means here, according to to the citation, pure Islam, and evil before Judgment Day. According to one hadith, an army with the black flag would emerge from Khorasan to help the Mahdi establish his caliphate at Mecca. The emergence of an army waving the black flag of jihad was thought to support the idea that the Afghan jihad would be the first step toward fulfilling the prophecy. Perhaps the most infamous use of prophecies in recent extremist propaganda is the Islamic State, and its use of apocalyptic prophecy drawn from the Quran and Hadith, which were to play a central role in the group's narrative. One of the group's glossy English language propaganda magazine was called Dabik, that I mentioned in the previous video, itself a direct reference to an end of time prophecy, according to which Dabik, which is the name originally of a town in northern Syria, and that is described as the location of the final confrontation between the Muslim armies and the Roman Crusaders, after which victorious Muslim armies will march on Constantinople, then on Rome, ushering in the end of times. The introduction of the first issue of Dabik states the following: according to the Hadith, the area will play a historical role in the battles leading up to the conquest of Constantinople, then Rome. Presently, Dabik is under the control of Crusader-backed Sahwat, close to the war front between them and the Khilafah. May Allah purify Dabik from the treachery of the Sahwa and raise the flag of the Khilafah over its land. And again, the examples that were given back then were related to Constantinople and Rome, just to give basically another comparative issue, like what I mentioned earlier about the prophecies of Nostradamus. Why are not given during this description and citation names of modern cities, modern civilizations? So all of it is a subjective interpretation. Either it is from the religion or from the prophecies that came in the case of Nostradamus and others. This passage links the rise of IS and its present-day campaign of violence, the one I just mentioned about the Dabik front and the treachery of the Sahwa and the flag of the Khilafah. So, a quote from the AQI founder Abu Musa Bazarkawi is printed at the start of each issue. The spark has been lit here in Iraq, and its heat will continue to intensify by Allah's permission until it burns the Crusader armies in Dabik. The temporary defeat and occupation of Dabik by IS forces provided propaganda double whammy. First, raising the flag of the Khilafah in Dabik seemingly proved the group's legitimacy as it was seen as the first step towards fulfilling the prophecy. Second, this implied the realization of the prophecy was close at hand. The final battle against the armies of the Crusaders and the conquest of the Constantinople and Rome issues were within reach. This belief generated an urgency to act. The time is now. The end times are upon us. Action cannot be delayed, etc. To increase this sense of urgency, the group highlighted other events in the prophecies, such as the restoration of slavery after the declaration of the caliphates, to strengthen the notion that the prophecy's fulfillment was fast approaching, as laid out in an article that was speaking about the revival of slavery before the hour in Dabik 4. It is interesting to note that slavery has been mentioned as one of the signs of the hour as well as one of the causes behind Al-Malham al-Kubra. So to summarize, extremist propaganda exploits prophecies in three ways. First, it could use it seemingly, as it has been realized, to establish legitimacy. An example for prophesized events having come true in the past and will come true again. Second, it uses the prophecies to support carrying out a certain type of action. For doing this will fulfill the prophecy. An example, the use of self-fulfilling prophecy. Third, it uses prophecies to predict an imminent future event, often apocalyptic, to create an urgency to act. While historical narratives are used to support and justify extremist ideologies, prophecies can be exploited to create the need to act now. And this what could be the comparative synthesis between the two, aiming to provide an insight into how historical narratives are exploited by extremist propagandists to strengthen their overarching group narratives, and draw an example of extremist groups, each of which in its own way can provide compelling example of propaganda. And there is a purpose of all this idea and this topic to not to compare the group that I mentioned either in the first video or the second, as they differ greatly in their ideologies, motivations, and operations. Instead, the idea is to apply the approach and concept of a competitive system of meaning as an analytical lens to investigate on how each of these disparate groups use the techniques to strengthen its system of meaning. They did it in five ways to summarize. First, in order to expand the sense of crisis, the current crisis is connected to past events to create a sense of temporal stretching in which current events are not viewed in isolation but as part of something bigger, the latest stage in an ongoing historic struggle. Second, solution support, in which historical examples are used to support the arguments for the proposed solution. The examples demonstrate that the solution is actually feasible. Third, historical narratives actually can be used to reinforce the in-group, out-group dynamic in two ways: by using history to trace the lineage of both groups to show how and who belongs in which group, and to provide legitimacy to the in-group's claim, and by continuing the current conflict to past events, connecting them together in order to reinforce the perception of a permanent struggle between the two groups. Fourth, by using historical narratives to strengthen the legitimacy and credibility of the messenger and therefore the impact of the message. To this end, the leadership of extremist groups frequently links themselves to past revered leaders, presenting themselves as their heirs thus appropriating their cultural capital to support their claims of legitimacy. And finally, extremist propaganda can make use of historical prophecies in one of three ways. First, by connecting past events to historical prophecies, the fulfillment of which serves to establish their legitimacy. Second, to justify carrying out a certain action because this would fulfill a given prophecy. And third, by using an impending crisis predicted by a prophecy to create a sense of urgency and therefore a need to act now. Historical narratives are a very potent tool in the hands of extremist propagandists that can be applied in a number of ways to strengthen the group's narratives. At its most basic, historical narratives provide a reservoir of evidence or data point that can be interwoven to create supporting arguments to the extremist viewpoints. However, what gives historical narratives their potency is their temporal characteristics, which is sharpened by the in group and the out group as the context that has been explained. However, the ability to connect the present to the past so that the current events are not viewed in isolation but as part of a temporal continuum is a big piece of work. In this way, today's conflicts are transformed into the latest stage of an historical struggle, and in group and out group dynamics are shown not to be the new dynamic, but a continuous or perpetual struggle between two groups, always traced back to history as old as possible in the timeline. In this way, the crisis, solution, and in-group, out-group dichotomies are deepened, and therefore the links between crisis plus in-group and the solution plus out-group are strengthened. So very important to focus on the explanatory nature of this topic in order to aim and show how historical narratives are appropriated in extremist propaganda. However, it's not appropriated to pretend that the mechanism listed in this analysis are by any means exhaustive. Further research is needed to explore this dynamic in order to examine more extremist groups and to justify other ways in which historical narratives are incorporated into extremist propaganda. Similarly, as suggested, an analysis of the narratives of the opponents of these extremist groups would be another interesting angle to investigate. The next step would be, of course, to apply the ideas described to a series of in-depth case studies on a number of extremist groups and their opponents. This would help, of course, better understanding the mechanism used by particular groups, but would also allow us to compare extremist groups and their opponents. Finally, given the prominence of historical levers in violent extremist propaganda, as outlined during this video and the past one, there are also many implications for advice regarding strategic communication policy for counterterrorism, countering violent extremism operation. So this basically sums up a little bit the summary and the conclusion that could be given from this part of the analysis, and it is always within a context of combating extremism within policies of defense and strategic communication. As I mentioned, those are some of the keywords when we speak about this. And Back to the Future, via the rule of prophecy, is a way to understand this topic. But there are also other things that I want to add before concluding this video that I already mentioned in the previous video, the first part, and this is regarding the concept of legitimacy and credibility and how to stand on the shoulder of giants. So the source of information, and particularly the credibility of the source, play an important role in the effectiveness of communications. The messenger is an important factor, as the message is. The foundations of effective strategic communication at the macro level are the three R's: the reach, the relevance, and the resonance. This, in turn, relies on the meso level comprised of the messenger, message, and medium of communication. All three aspects are required for communication to be effective. There is much support in research across several fields that are exploring how the perception of the source of information can shape the way the message itself is interpreted and processed. Hence, an important aspect of extremist propaganda is to present the extremists and especially their leaders as credible messengers. Extremist groups are often led by charismatic leaders who present themselves as powerful and credible messengers. Such leaders often emphasize developing their identity and image to increase their charismatic appeal. One way of doing this is to build on the charismatic capital of previous leaders by drawing linkages through symbolism or quotation between past and present leaders. In this way, they can claim to belong to a lineage of revered leaders. And labeling this transformative charisma is basically very important because it's in which the charismatic capital of past leader is drawn upon to bolster current leaders. The book Charismatic Leadership Phenomenon in Radical and Militant Islamism is a good source to read in this context of action, as it traces a long line of charismatic leaders as within militant Islamism who have all built on the charismatic capital of their predecessors to enhance their image and identity, and so come to embody the system of meaning. This book explains that Al Qaeda founder bin Laden emerged by not only drawing upon charismatic predecessors such as Azzam and Qutb, but by surrounding himself by older Islamists with decades of experience in their regionally based struggles, for example, Ayman al Zawahiri and Muhammad Atif to increase this own charismatic capital, of course. Similarly, bin Laden would cite medieval theologian Ibn Taymiyyah to back up his assertion and create an aura of legitimacy. More directly, he also deliberately tried to embody the warrior scholar image of his mentor Azzam. These trends are still prevalent in contemporary Islamist groups. Both Al Qaeda and the Islamic State constantly refer to leaders from decades and centuries past to appropriate their charismatic capital, weaving past and present into one continuity of identity. This technique is used in the Inspire magazine that was published by Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in the sections on history and strategy, and also in Dabiq magazine published by the Islamic States in from the page to history section. For example, Inspire carries a regular feature called Words of Wisdom, presenting quotations from prominent jihadi leaders, including such revered past leaders as Sheikh Abdullah Azzam Sayyid Qutb and the blind Sheikh Umar Abdul Rahman. This is a clear attempt to situate AQAP as the heirs to their works. In the same section, prominent Islamist ideologue and strategist Abu Musab al-Suri writes a series of articles called "The Jihadi Experience." Here he provides, of course, a critique of past jihadist campaign in the jihadi currents from 1963 to 2001, in which he identifies successful and unsuccessful strategies. Al-Suri promotes the strategies used in Chechnya, Bosnia, and Afghanistan, and outlines his military theory of the global Islamic resistance call. These articles portray the efforts of Al Qaeda as a continuation of the same struggle of the last 6 decades of jihad. Similarly, in the Islamic State's Dabiq article from Pages of History, they give other examples in the lessons from the fitna of the Mongols. In the issue 14 of Dabiq, it provides a selected quote from influential 13th century theologian Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah from the time of the Mongol invasion, in which the Shaykh draws pretty much comparison between the Battle of Al-Ahzab in the time of the Prophet and the Fitna of Ghazan, presenting lessons for the believers that will continue to remain relevant and crucial until the camp of Iman defeats the camp of Kufr once and for all. Another article in the same series spoke about the expeditions, battles, and victories of Ramadan and recounts the victorious battles in which the Prophet participated or led during Ramadan. Now, to switch to the example of Ireland, the provisional IRA in this context of action also drew legitimacy from linking their struggle to those of their predecessors. From Wolfe Tone, from 1753 to 1798, known as the father of Irish republicanism, as the many leaders of the 1916 Easter Rising, including James Connolly and Patrick Pearse, it's very important to refer to revolutionary leaders, not exclusive to the provisional movements. They, like others, used this device to legitimize and strengthen the renewed struggle. The provisionals claim to be heirs of Wolfe Tone, and it's exemplified in the second issue of Anne Fallblack of 1970 that has been released just prior to the anniversary of the Easter Rising. The article entitled "What the 1916 Rising Meant" makes basically reference to Wolfe's gospel, which was to break the connection with England, the never failing source of all political evils, according to the IRA. The provisional also claims that their Republican counterparts are incapable of being the heirs to this ongoing struggle, and thereby they link to the crisis not only the classic out group, the English, but also members of the in group, other Irish Republicans. This is evidenced in the same column as it is cited. If today men hold commemoration to Easter weekend and the same time support and uphold the British conquest in Ireland, they are, as Pearse would describe them, tyrants, hypocrites, and liars. There are a number of groups claiming to be Republican who support the maintenance of two partition states. The column that I mentioned ends with a plea to followers to continue supporting only the goals of the provisional branch, to refuse to recognize any group that should deny Ireland its right to having a unified government. So, in this Easter Sunday, as we gather around the graves, as they mentioned, of our martyrs dead, we should again repudiate all institution which would limit the complete sovereignty of Ireland. The summary of this is that the messenger is an important factor, as the message is, as the perceived legitimacy and the credibility of the messenger greatly impacts how a message is interpreted. To increase their apparent legitimacy and credibility, the leaders of extremist groups frequently link themselves to past revered leaders, presenting themselves as their heirs. In this way, they appropriate cultural capital all too easy to support their claim and legitimacy. So this is basically another part that I want to mention within the context of this very critical topic regarding the historical narratives and their role in extremist propaganda. Always remember that the key words here is to focus on what's going to be beneficial for defensive and defense strategic communication for counterterrorism, and the main words while we analyze all this synthesis wise should be always around the hashtags I mentioned yesterday on the first video, the keywords: terrorism, violent extremism, propaganda, and strategic communications. Thank you for your time.